Hello, welcome to my home. Make yourself comfortable. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the language of the sacred. Every symbol implies a representative and something being represented. It's a relationship between two ideas, or between an idea and its shadow. This is addressed in a specific field called semiology, which I find interesting. I know a little about it, but I don't intend to stick only to semiology, but also to bring in many concepts from traditional classical philosophy and Eastern philosophy. In other words, to give a simple, practical approach, so that you can understand how grasping the meaning of symbols can help you live better. I hope I succeed in this approach in our conversation today. So let's get started. Regarding the idea of the sacred, there was an anthropologist from the last century named Mircea Eliade, whose definition, out of everything I've read, really stuck with me. The word has its origin in Indo-European, coming from sec, which means to sanctify. That is, to set apart a space and give it a special value. And Mircea Eliade used to say that the sacred is the function of giving meaning. I think this concept is great, the function of giving meaning. It means you redeem, rescue something from banality, and bring it into a realm where it has a truly special value. It represents something very important to you. In many ceremonies from various religious traditions, sometimes, when you perform a ritual, candles are placed and the steps are surrounded. In other words, you set boundaries and illuminate. That is now a space endowed with a meaning, greater than its material use. It represents something beyond matter. For the Greeks, there was always the possibility of either trivializing or sanctifying life. When we give something, an object, a space, a place, or a person, a meaning beyond its mere physical presence, but a representation of something greater that becomes sacred to us. If you consider the ancient traditions, especially those from the East, they believed that the purpose of man was to make his entire life sacred. In other words, for all of it to be filled with meaning, redeemed from arbitrariness, imbued with a value that is more than just its material presence, but also what it conveys, the idea it embodies and represents within our lives. In other words, the sacred would be the function of giving meaning. Things that are not situated, that are not associated with an idea, would be trivial, lacking any sense of meaning. Let me give a small example of something I've even mentioned in other talks. I really like beautiful things, beautiful objects. Very recently, I went into a home decor store full of very beautiful objects, but none of them interested me. Do you know why? None of them were symbolic representations of anything. There were lots of stylized things, vases, pieces of all kinds, but they were merely a collection of shapes and colors to match the rug or the sofa. There was no idea behind it, and for me, something that doesn't carry an idea is very insignificant. So, when you want to give someone a gift, and an object reminds you of a quality of that person, or reminds you of a virtue you wish for that person, or recalls some ancient symbol that represents a certain attitude toward life, you're not just giving a physical object, you're giving an idea, you're giving inspiration, or is giving a vote of greatness to that person, so that they may come to achieve the fullness of that symbol. So things gain value and transcend when they are symbolic. They are no longer just a material object. And we're going to talk a lot about this. Well, let's see that today, when we talk about an ancient civilization, or about a particular story of a people, or about a certain story from a mythological pantheon. Those who, often, understand this subject have a very horizontal understanding. They know everything in terms of data. They know everything in terms of date descriptions. They know everything, or everything that can be known, depending on the civilization, the historical moment. Everything that is within the reach of science, in terms of what happened there. But when you try to delve into knowledge of what lies beyond that, Why those things happened, not just how they happened, but what they meant, what value they had for those people, what they wanted to represent with that. You're left in silence. In other words, often the knowledge in our historical moment is horizontal. It's shallow, it's broad, but not deep. We know everything that was said, but we don't know what they meant by it. There isn't much depth. In the sense of seeing beyond what is written, what was put behind it, what was meant to be, revealed by those words that were written or those structures that were left behind. We live in a time where we know a lot about how things were, the know-how, but very little about why they were that way and what people wanted to express through them. So, let's keep talking a bit about this meaning that might be behind things. What is symbolism? Where is it found? Is it everywhere? Should it be present in our lives as well? Well, in Greece there was an expression, a word, which was sambalo. Sambalo referred to a small plaque, usually made of clay, that two friends would have. This plaque, when they eventually needed to part ways, if one of them was going far away, they would break the plaque in half, in such a way that only those two pieces would fit together perfectly. Each person kept one half. Sometimes the person would leave for another place and come back decades later, or wouldn't return, sending their child instead. When he arrived with that little piece of clay plaque, they would fit together and form a whole again. They recognized each other by becoming whole once more. A child of an old friend who had left, but had left that plaque with him, was also considered part of that family. Two halves that found each other. This idea is really interesting. If you look at the etymology of the symbol itself, the word symbalos means something that was thrown into the world, but that remained connected to something that stayed in the realm of ideas. In other words, two things that fit together perfectly if placed side by side. What we are and what we represent in the world. Our essence and our image. Do they fit together? If they do, then our physical personality is a perfect symbol of our immaterial essence. And it seems that this is what was expected of human beings, that they would represent the idea that lies behind their physical appearance, and that they would represent it as faithfully as possible. Continuing on, in Egypt there was this concept of the symbol as two hands joined together, in the form of ideograms, of hieroglyphs. It was represented as two hands joined together, meaning there is a message we have come to bring to the world. And the symbol is what contains it, conceals it, and also reveals it. It tries, in the best way possible, to present this to the world without distorting it. It's as if you imagine that there is a hand of our essence, a fragment of the hand of God, a fragment of the world of ideas that needs to carry out a task in the material world. And our appearance, our personality, our entire physical, psychological, and mental structure, which is what I mean when I say personality, would be like a glove. That would have to properly fit this hand of essence, this hand of being, so that it would have the freedom and precision to carry out its work in the world. When this glove doesn't properly represent the hand, it doesn't allow it to act. Either it's too tight, or it's too loose, or the fingers are stuck. It doesn't allow the hand of the spirit to act in the material world. This means that what we appear to be doesn't match our essence. There hasn't been a vertical dialogue between who we are and what we are presenting. And this is a very interesting concept for us to set as a goal. The wise man would be the one whose essence and appearance match perfectly. It's like a hand that is well served by a glove that fits it perfectly, and is able to act freely in the world and fulfill its mission in life. So, according to ancient traditions, which already presented, in a more abstract, not very well-defined way, this idea of the symbol. There are two types of creation, one, from nature, for those who prefer a divine creation, that is, a creation in which we do not participate, but from which we benefit. And human creation, everything we develop from nature to serve us in some way. and which makes up what we call culture. Both of these creations have an idea behind them, and they came into the world to represent that idea. To be able to create a passport for ideas to arrive in the world. We can then say that any and every type of creation that has been effective and corresponds to the idea that generated it is a good glove and fits the hand it is meant to serve. It works well in the world, serving the being that inspired it. It's like a word. Have you ever imagined the person who one day created the word love? What were they feeling? They created a word to represent that feeling. Does that word, nowadays, still truly represent that feeling? Or has it become distorted? Does it mean just anything now? The emptying of words is also a very significant symbolic loss. So, for India, for example, we live in an illusory world. For these ancient peoples, especially those from the East, the concept of reality is what is eternal. Everything that is temporary, everything that is perishable is an illusion, and we live in a world where everything is just shadows, everything is fleeting. So everything is Maya. Maya was an Indian goddess who represented illusions. So, we live in a world of Maya, where things do not exist in themselves. They are, in fact, reflections of things that truly exist. Through them you can reach the object, just as through the shadow I can perceive and confront the object that created it. The things of the material world are an invitation for you to rise up to their essence and see face to face the idea that generated them. But nothing in the world would be truly real. When we bring this over to Greece, to Plato's allegory of the cave, for those who are familiar, it's the same idea, a dark cave, which in reality is only representing real objects. And the idea is for man to go toward the light and see things as they truly are. In other words, to the realm of essences, to the realm of ideas. That is, a symbol would be a faithful representation of the object that is trying to manifest itself through it in the world. A bridge between two worlds. This is very important to understand. A true symbol is always a vertical bridge between an essence and an appearance. It reveals something to the world that could not be revealed without it. Something that does not belong to this dimension, that does not belong to the material world. I brought you an image that I find quite interesting, which is how I represented a passage from Plato's book, The Republic. At a certain point, Socrates, the central character of the book, talks with a young man who was part of the dialogue, Glaucon. He wants to explain to Glaucon something similar to this idea of the symbol, and says, "Imagine, Glaucon, that a man falls into the sea, and his body stays there, and over time it gets eaten away by sea creatures, gets covered with crustaceans, and becomes deformed. And when someone pulls this body out of the sea, you can hardly recognize it as a human body anymore. It looks like something bizarre and strange." Now, imagine what this story really means. Falling into the sea, in general, in ancient symbolism, the sea, the horizontality of the waters, represented the material world. If you take a glass of water and turn it any which way, the water will always stay horizontal. That's the world of matter. Whereas fire, no matter how you turn a torch, it always stays vertical. It would be the cross of the world, spirit and matter. Falling into the sea, in general, means falling into the material world. So, Socrates suggests here that when a human being falls into the material world, they start to become deformed, losing their human form, and other things start to stick to them, to the point that when you look, you can no longer recognize them as a representative of the human race. Imagine that, in the realm of ideas, there is a form that represents the material world. Stones that evolve through inertia. A diamond is highly evolved because of its molecular structure, which makes it extremely inert and resistant. Inertia is a virtue for a stone, but for a human, it would be laziness. But when a person takes this symbol of the mineral and applies it to themselves, they become deformed. And then comes the plant world. Plants, which are the base of the food chain. They perform an important gas exchange. They generate all the food for the entire chain above them. So, they are the great collectors and transformers of energy. This is a virtue for plants. But if a human becomes merely a collector of energies, this for him is greed, it is ambition. So they become even more deformed, taking on an archetype that isn't theirs. For animals, what would be desirable for them? The instinct for survival and the instinct to perpetuate the species. Humans take what is a virtue for an animal species and apply it to themselves, and end up acting fully on instinct. And they have just a little bit of the human idea, which would be the pursuit of values, virtues, and wisdom, but just a little. When you put all of this together, you end up with something like a Frankenstein, deformed. So much so that when you look at it, you can't even tell what it is. Evolution would be, in a certain way, removing from ourselves the ideas that are not human, and putting everything in its proper place. That is Plato's concept of justice, and embracing the idea that gave rise to us. As we get closer to that idea, which we came to represent in the world, we are evolving. We are developing, unrolling the papyrus of the mystery of our own life. Because to develop comes from that, desarrollo, to unroll, to open up. This papyrus that contains the mystery of our very essence. In other words, getting closer to what is expected of a human being, clearing away other ideas, which are good in their own place, but are not appropriate for us. This representing the human idea, in its fullness, would be the human ideal. According to these traditions, there's a very interesting example of this in Plato's dialogue, The Republic. I've put together a few simple ideas here for you, so you can better understand this relationship. In society, we have various ways of representing things through an ideogram, through a logo. So, for example, I put here a bottle of Coca-Cola and the Coca-Cola symbol. The symbol and what it symbolizes are on the same level. They belong to the same material world. Whereas if you have a true symbol, for example, a dove, that dove represents peace. This peace is not on the material plane, it's not right next to it. It's an idea, it's an archetype, it's the ideal. This relationship is vertical. A symbol is always based on a vertical relationship. The representative and what is represented are not in the same world. One is on the plane of ideas and the other is on the material plane. And when they correspond effectively, that's a good symbol. It represents its idea well in the world. It gets its message across clearly. So let's not confuse. Ideograms, logos, these are not symbols. Symbols are bridges between the spiritual world and the material world, between the plane of ideas and the plane where ideas are materialized. Here's a very interesting example brought up by Professor Jorge Angel of Raga, founder of New Acropolis. He gives a rather curious example. Imagine that we're going to do a technical analysis of a book, but we don't know how to read. So, with all the technological tools we have today, we'll examine the paper fibers, what they're made of, when they were made. We'll do some dating. Analyze the leather of the cover, how it was processed, which animal it came from, how the leather was tanned. The ink that was used for the lettering on the cover. The ink that was used to print those graphic symbols on the pages. We know the entire physical structure of the book in great detail. There's just one thing we don't know and don't believe. That by putting those little graphic symbols together, you form increasingly larger units that refer to something that isn't inside the book, it's somewhere else. So in that pile of paper, leather, and ink, you can have references to a world that has no physical substance at all. You could be talking about honesty, fraternity, goodness, justice. You could be referring to things that are outside the book. A very materialistic person would look at these graphic units, which are the letters, would know everything about them, but wouldn't know what they mean when they're put together. Notice that this is more or less what we do. We are going to study Egypt. You show an image of the god Anubis. You know how it was made, what material was used, when it was probably painted, which dynasty it belongs to. You know the basic attributes that were given to him, but you can't say, within that context, for example, the embalming of a dead person combined with another god, what that, as a phrase, as a sentence, could mean, what that referred to, what was being expressed there. In other words, we don't know how to turn those symbols into Emblems as a set, into words, into sentences, that could lead us to realities that go beyond the book. So we interpret isolated pieces. We dissect the symbols of the past, but we don't know how to read them when they're all together. We don't know what they represent, and this isn't just with symbols from the past. We do the same thing with our own lives. As you've seen, according to Indian tradition, if we take it as a reference, everything is symbolic, including our own lives. The events in our lives happen in a sequence that corresponds to our need for gaining awareness. They're not random, they're drawn to us by our desire to grow, by our will to learn, to overcome limitations. And there's an intelligent sequence of things there that want to convey something. We treat everything as random. We treat everything as isolated events, with no connection between them. And we don't read the sentence that life has sent us. I always give an example, one that's pretty well known in my talks, which is when you get in a line. And your line is the one that moves the slowest. Then you switch lines, that line moves, and the other one stops. How do we usually react to things like this? We see it as a coincidence, just bad luck, it happened now. Soon it won't happen anymore. It could have happened to anyone. But what if I see this event as being full of meaning? What is life trying to tell me with this? Maybe it's suggesting that I need to be more patient, that I need to control my anxiety, to rein in my overly exaggerated sense of self-importance. In other words, elements of our lives may have more than just a superficial and banal message. And random message. Maybe there's a kind of grammar there, maybe behind it all. A lesson to be learned. We have to learn how to read life, starting with our own, before we try to interpret the lives of Egyptians, Greeks, Celts, or whoever else. This complex symbolism of people who lived in other cultures, but who, deep down, talked about the same thing, human life, how to face it, how to reach the development that is meant for us, so we can achieve the fullness of the human condition, which is what all of nature expects from us. Continuing, as I mentioned to you, within the same work, Plato's Republic, there is its very famous chapter 7, the allegory of the cave. I won't tell the whole story because there's not enough time. There's a lecture about it on our Nova Acropolis YouTube channel. What? Basically, there is a certain moment when one of the men who lived in the cave, while looking at shadows projected on the wall, manages to free himself from that cave, goes out into the things illuminated by the sunlight, sees what objects are causing those shadows, and out of compassion decides to return. But what happens is that those prisoners who are still inside the cave, among them, they choose the one who is the most skilled, the cleverest, the one who can best identify the shadows, the order in which they usually appear, how they move, what sounds come from them. In other words, among them, they have a leader who is the one who understands shadows most, someone who spent his life studying shadows. Now you realize that a man who went outside, in other words, who has a vertical relationship, goes up out of the cave to see the sunlight, understands where the shadows come from, sees the objects that are casting the shadows when he comes back. In 2 minutes, he knows more about the shadows than the one who studied them his whole life. But who doesn't know their origin, who never looked at things vertically, who never rose to the realm of ideas, who never saw what is behind the shadows. In other words, in 2 minutes, he masters the knowledge of the shadows better than the one who only accumulated horizontal knowledge. This reflection underlying this myth is very interesting. What does it mean? To know about the shadows of the material world? Is it simply collecting their characteristics or understanding what caused them? A view of what is behind the shadows already gives us a much clearer definition of what they are, of what the meaning of life is, of what is behind all of this, where all of this is leading us. Continuing. Professor Jorge Angel Livraga, founder of New Acropolis, used to say that if in the future our civilization were lost and an archaeologist from a few thousand years from now found a treatise, for example, on modern chemistry, a periodic table, some definitions of chemical elements, with no knowledge of the context in which we live, They might think that H2O was a magic formula, a mantra, that we used to have fun standing in circles, chanting sacred mantras like NaOH or O. You have to admit that's ridiculous. But he wouldn't know the structure behind an H2O or a NaOH. He would interpret it literally, based on what it means to him. You see, that's what we do with our own past. We look at it superficially, interpreting it according to our own biases, and we don't know what that actually represented, because there's a whole history behind it that we're no longer able to grasp. And it's not just because we're missing historical data. It's because we've lost the ability to perceive the symbolism in our own lives, in the events that happen to us. More than reading 1,000 books, understanding symbolism is about learning to have a dialogue with your own life and seeing what it's trying to tell you at every moment. Life is entirely pedagogical. Says the Bardo Thodol in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, that if there were even a single minute in your life that had nothing to teach you, it would have already been removed from your life, because life doesn't leave leftovers, life doesn't leave empty spaces. So, if every moment of our lives wants to teach us something, it means that behind each one of them, there is a signifier, there is an idea that is being represented through this event. This fact, this sound, this person, this word, countless ways in which these ideas reach us. And we, so often, are like students who are present in body but not in spirit. We see all of this and yet we don't see. We see all of this and yet we don't read what it represents. So we end up living through repetitive experiences without learning what they mean. It's as if we were children who keep repeating the same grade without understanding what the subject matter of that year has to offer, what the curriculum of that year is meant to teach. So, many times, we are the ones repeating life's lessons, because we don't know how to speak the language of life, which is symbolism. And, not knowing how to speak the language of life, we don't communicate with it. If every time life presents you with something, you stop and think, what is it trying to tell me? And you take the right attitude, a change in your approach, you'll notice that life brings something else. You respond with a new attitude, an appropriate response, a shift in your position. There will come a certain moment when you'll feel a strong curiosity to know who this hidden interlocutor is, who, behind the scenes of life, communicates with you through events, through moments. What is he trying to tell you? Who is he? Because many times you'll notice that life gives you answers when you make an effort to understand it. It responds, it reinforces your attempts at change when you're heading in the right direction. The language of life is symbolism. So, for me, understanding the symbolic perspective is the same as being a philosopher, making it your goal to interpret life. To give it meaning, to know that it is not chaos, but cosmos, that it has something to teach us. That it is pedagogical. Without this, it's all superficiality. We fall into the quantitative, and not the qualitative, into the horizontal, never the vertical. Our knowledge is sometimes as shallow as a saucer or like a big bowl of soup. Very wide, but very shallow. We need to know what lies beyond, the little letters written in the book. We need to know what words they form, and what those words point to, which is far beyond the book, sometimes far beyond the manifested world. So this is a suggestion for you to notice. I was very brief. I only shared a few basic ideas. As I told you, it's a whole universe of circumstances and concepts behind all this. I was quite concise, and my goal is not to make anyone an expert in semiotics or anything like that, but to make you consider it. That life is symbolic and, more than that our own personality has as its purpose to be a symbol of something higher. But we can't represent what we don't know. Hence the need for an inner life, for reflection, for self-knowledge, so that our personality has the opportunity to represent our hidden dweller in the world. I often suggest to my students that one day they place a large mirror in front of themselves, close their eyes, and then open them and think, I'm about to be introduced to a new person, someone I don't know. And when you open your eyes, notice the first impression that your image gives you. You'll notice that there's a lot in your posture, in the way you dress. In your gaze, there's a lot that is symbolic and represents ideas that aren't really yours, that you absorbed from society. It could be that your personality is representing trendy ideas and not what you truly believe, because you don't know how to evaluate what your personality is for, what you're representing. Not seeking to have coherence between these two worlds, having an inner life and expressing it in your outer life, is a challenge for anyone who wants to know themselves and find their place as a human being in the world. Well, that's basically the conversation I wanted to bring to you. I hope you reflect on this and remember, the symbol is like a glove that fits the hand of the spirit, and our role is to be a suitable glove, so that our own essence can deliver its message to the world. Because that's what we came here for. Our word is sacred. Remember the Dhammapada, which says that more than 1,000 meaningless words, one word that brings comfort to the listener is worth more. A word that adds to the world, a word that makes a difference. There is something inside us wanting to speak that word. May our voice serve that something. Understand that our personality, if it doesn't symbolize our essence, will end up symbolizing something else from society, other ideas that we might not even believe in. Think about that for a moment. Thank you very much and a big hug to everyone.